Hey guys, welcome back. So if I'm being honest, today's video was actually inspired by what I have been going through recently, which is to say just a little bit of a reading slump. It's a little ironic actually, because if you guys have been around for a while, a couple of weeks ago you would have seen that I had a video called How to Beat a Reading Slump. I wasn't in a reading slump then, but somehow between then and now I've kind of fallen into one. I'm out of it now, but nevertheless, it inspired the purpose behind this video, which is to say, since I hadn't been reading, I have been listening to a lot of podcasts. And that said, I figured I would share with you guys some book recommendations based on certain podcasts that I know that I either listen to or are really popular. I guess technically it could go either way. So if you've read this certain book, then maybe these podcasts would be something that you're interested in. So as always, let me know in the comments below what you guys are reading, what you think of these suggestions, and while we're at it, if you listen to podcasts and what your favorite ones are, because personally I love them. I really alternate between listening to audiobooks and listening to podcasts, because I find that podcasts are really helpful when I've got a shorter amount of time and I want to have like a complete story, since the majority of them are episodic. So let's just kind of dive right in. I've got my scratchy chicken scratch list here, so we can just start going down the list. I've actually got about I'd say 8 recommendations for you guys. So without further ado, number 1. So my first recommendation is based on the podcast Science Versus. Now, if you've never heard of the podcast Science Versus, it is a podcast that really talks about just different things and goings on in science. So they break down a lot of myths, they explain a lot of things. What I really like about it is that it's very approachable. So if you do like the podcast Science Versus, I've actually got 2 recommendations for you. The first one is called The 3-Body Problem, and then the other one is called I, Robot. So both of these have some kind of science element in them, which is why I think that they are a great suggestion and accompany Science Versus well. So as far as the 3-body problems, simply put, you've got a female astrophysicist who sends out a message into space, just seeing if there is life out there. Lo and behold, she gets a response. However, the response that she gets is essentially warning her to be careful about making our world known, making Earth known, because you're really putting yourself out there, be it good or bad, for other planets or other species to come and either wage war or just anything that could go wrong. The other suggestion that I have is I, Robot. Now, I will say, because naturally we know that there's a movie out with Will Smith about it, it's not that at all. So regardless of if you're a fan of that movie or not, put that out of your mind, because this is something totally different. First of all, it's actually a series of short stories by Isaac Asimov, and really what it comes down to is the question about what is consciousness. Naturally, there are robots involved, and the actual storyline I'm not really going to go over too much, because like I said, it's a bunch of short stories, but you've got essentially where the whole first rule of robotics, or just all of the rules of robotics, came into play. And it is a fictional book, and it's really interesting because you are following people who are working with artificial intelligence and those specific robots, and answering the question about what exactly is the first law of robotics, which of course is do no harm to humans. But there is a plot line in there where a robot lies, and all kinds of questions come into play, because naturally we might think of lying as bad, but if you're lying for the right reasons, does that make it, you know, not harmless? I don't know, but either way, I would say check both of those books out if you're interested in the whole scientific grappling of the Science Versus podcast and you want to kind of expand your genre more. Okay, so the next recommendation that I have for you guys is based on the podcast Wait, Don't Tell Me. This is actually an NPR show. I think it comes on Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon for me. It's probably different from where you are, but now it's a podcast. You can catch the old episodes, and essentially what it is a weekly pop culture game show that has interviews interviews and special guests every week. The interviews by the special guests vary from like celebrities that you may know, comedians, people in politics or people in science, just a broad spectrum of things. So the books that I recommend based on that, I've got two actually. The first one is the autobiography called Educated, and then the other is a fictional book called The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Now, as far as the book Educated, like I said, this is a biography and it is essentially about a woman who grew up really poor, very uneducated, and how she basically took the initiative to elevate herself, become smarter, go to school, teach herself how to read, etc. First of all, I think that is such a courageous thing to do, but I wanted to recommend that one based on Wait, Don't Tell Me because of the pop culture questionnaire aspect of the show. If you're familiar with the format, you've got the guest hosts as well as audience members answering questions based on what happens in the news that week. So you've kind of got that quiz element, which I think binds the two together. Now, as far as the Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, the reason that I recommended that one is based on the celebrity guest aspect. So the premise behind the book is that you've got a woman, obviously her name is Evelyn, where she's chronicling her life because she is a older Hollywood starlet and naturally she has had 7 loves in the past, but she's telling her story to someone. And so we get to see how she lived her life and all of the great stories that she has to tell. And I think also that goes well with Wait, Don't Tell Me because the guests that they have are very interesting. A lot of them I recognize because, like I said, they are from pop culture or political figures who I recognize, but a lot of them I also have never heard of, and so kind of hearing about their lives and what they do I think is interesting and why it relates to the Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. So my next suggestion is based on my personal favorite podcast, which is called My Favorite Murder. I actually had way long ago when I first started this channel, I actually did a video chronicling different books that you can read if you liked the My Favorite Murder podcast, and since then I've actually got a couple new recommendations, which is why I decided to throw it in this time around with the rest of the podcast. So yet again, I've got 2 books for you guys. The first one is called The Passengers, and the second one, let me look at my list. Oh, the second one, The Silent Patient. How could I forget? So you probably have heard of The Silent Patient because it's been all abuzz the book world recently. But if you didn't know, a quick rundown. Well, let me back up. Let me tell you what My Favorite Murder is about. So simply put, it's 2 women who discuss their favorite murder. Simply put. But what makes that podcast so great is the chemistry between the 2 women because they're very down to earth. It's like sitting down and talking to friends. And also there's some kind of satisfaction going on with the fact that you, or maybe it's just me, share this fascination with serial killers and with unsolved murders like these women do. And so naturally the stories that they tell every week are either murders that have been solved and we already know who commits them, and then a few of them, you know, every once in a while you get unsolved murders. So as far as the books that I recommend, both of those are thriller mystery-esque. The Silent Patient is about a woman who kills her husband and then she is brought to a psychiatric hospital because she then proceeds to just go mute and she refuses to talk to anybody, confess or otherwise. And we're trying to figure out why she's that way and then why she killed her husband. Now, as far as The Passengers, the reason that I added it is because I thought it was a fun twist on a thriller. So what you've got are, I think like a series of 6 to 8 self-driving cars, and each one of them is on a crash collision course. They each have different passengers inside, and so you as the viewer or you as the reader have to figure out who to save. And so you are getting the story of each of those people because in the beginning you think obviously they're all victims, but once you start learning about them and their history and their background, things get a little bit gray. My next podcast book recommendation is based on the podcast Binge Mode. Now, if you are familiar with this one, you know that they do, I would say, different segments or different themes, and so that leads me into my book recommendations because the 2 books that I recommend for that or I guess in this case vice versa, because you very well may have likely read these books already, but the Harry Potter series and the Game of Thrones series. Now, the reason that I recommend those is because the great thing about binge mode is that it's exactly what it sounds like. You binge these series. I picked Harry Potter and Game of Thrones because those are the two prolific ones, but I believe they've got other series as well that they talk about on the show, but I'm just drawing a blank. And what I love about this is that if you are a fan of one of the series that they're talking about, or if you've ever wanted to get into it, you can go all in. So for example, with binge mode, their Harry Potter segment, they go through all 7 of the books chapter by chapter. That's actually a really great idea if you wanted to do a reread. So for example, the reason that I discovered them is because I read Harry Potter way long ago, but I like to reread it and revisit it every now and again. And instead of just rereading them and saying watching the movies for like the 1000th time, listening to this podcast, I got a different take. So you've got 2 people discussing the ins and outs of every single chapter. And it's just really interesting because you are hearing their perspective, which I think is fun. It makes the reread a little fresh, like I said, if you're rereading them again. But if you are new to them, then I think it's fun to follow along. So if you were reading, say, Game of Thrones for the first time, you could read the assigned chapters, or rather the chapters that they're going to talk about in the podcast episode, and then proceed to listen to the podcast episode, and then thereon until you're done with the series. So I would definitely recommend that, even if you have read the books, like I said, because it's a fun way to revisit old classics. All right, so I know I said my favorite murder was my favorite podcast, and I guess it is, but coming in close second, depending on the time of the year that I'm feeling, whichever one that I'm listening to, I've got another favorite podcast, and it's called My Dad Wrote a Porno. Now, I don't think that they are currently coming out with any new shows right now, but they've got a long, lengthy backlist. So if you're doing this in reverse and you're looking for podcast recommendations based on the book, just be warned. But if you have known about the podcast or you've listened to it, my 2 book suggestions are 50 Shades of Grey and Not So Nice Guy. So let me back it up really quick. So My Dad Wrote a Porno is, first of all, hilarious. It's a comedy podcast, and it is about a guy and his 2 friends who read aloud chapter by chapter a erotic book, a badly written erotic book that the host's dad wrote. And so the name of the book, or it's a few books actually, because it came out with like 2 sequels, but the name of the book is called Belinda Blinked, and it's just awful, but in the best kind of way. I will say the hosts of the show are very charismatic, and so doing it in their dramatic reading with all of their side commentary just takes it to the next level. So that said, it's probably obvious why I chose 50 Shades of Grey, which, if you didn't know, is because it can be considered badly written erotica. I know that it's been spoofed a lot of times, it's been made fun of, and you know, give it a read for yourself if by some chance you haven't read it yet. I'm not even going to tell you what it's about because it's so prolific. They've made movies about it, and I don't want to waste my breath. But as far as the other book, Not So Nice Guy by R.S. Gray, this one is a romantic comedy. It's not badly written erotica. It is a friends to lovers romance, but I wanted to put that out there as a suggestion because she writes excellent romance comedy. If you are not new around here, you know that I have gushed about her more than once. And this one, like I said, it's a friends to lovers, and it is about a guy and his coworker. They're both teachers, and they've been friends for the longest time, but he wants to take it to the next level, and she might or might not want to, but regardless, it could potentially jeopardize their friendship. Storyline aside, like I said, it's a romantic comedy, so you're gonna get a lot of laugh out loud bits, and that's something that is perfect because, like I said, the podcast My Dad Wrote a Porno is hilarious, so you're gonna get that comedy element in there for sure. Okay, so the next podcast that I want to talk about is Stuff You Miss in History Class, and simply put, it's a podcast where each episode talks about little factoids in history, but from a really approachable way. Once again, 2 suggestions for you guys. Based on that, the first one is a Japanese historical fiction book called Shogun, and then the other book is called 11 1762. I always get the date confused, which is ironic because it's a specific date. That one is trying to prevent the Kennedy assassination. So naturally it's fiction, but even though it's fiction, it is laced with historical facts because obviously Kennedy is a real guy or was a real guy. So that is one way that it relates to the history podcast. Now, as far as Shogun, this takes place in the 1600s, I think exactly 1600, but it takes place in Japan. And what happens is you've got a guy who gets washed up on Japan. He is a British soldier, I believe, or maybe he's American. But regardless, him and his shipmates are currently in war, and so they end up getting shipwrecked in Japan. And so for the first few years of their lives, they are taken to prison. They're in prison because they're strangers in the land. But when the guy is released, instead of going back home, he stays in Japan to learn the ways and the culture of the people at the time. And it's really just like an interesting look from an outsider's perspective as to what the Japanese culture is all about, especially since at that time they're a very closed off society, and outsiders didn't really know what the culture was about. And I would call it like an epic saga. It's very lengthy, so gird your loins with that, but the payoff is completely worth it because the details in it are just very interesting. They are also laced with history, actual facts, and so you're gonna get something out of it either from the fictional point of view or the non-fictional point of view. Next up, we have the podcast Myths and Legends. So if you're familiar with this podcast, you know that they talk about exactly what the title sounds like, which are different myths and different legends, different folklore. And so that said, the two recommendations that I have for you guys are Circe and then Percy Jackson in the Olympian series. So essentially we are dealing with a teen who finds out that he is an offspring of Zeus somehow, and so he is coming to grips with the fact that he is a half god. And because he is a teen, he's got kind of like his sidekick companions, and he is making his way through trying to figure out who he is while also having to like battle actual I don't want to call them demons, but like other gods and things in that world. Now, as far as Circe goes, this one is of course based on a god, and Circe is born of the house of Helios, and so she is brought up trying to, I guess, come into her own power, but Zeus is threatened by her power, and so she is having to kind of figure out the ins and out of coming into her own while also trying to figure out how she can defeat Zeus, because naturally we all know he's like this super strong god who has quite a hell of a vengeance. Even if you've never heard of the podcast, I would definitely recommend reading Circe. And can we just talk about the cover? You guys know that I put covers up. I'll put it up again now, but the cover itself is just so beautiful, and I will be honest, that was a reason a while ago I even put it on my list because I was so drawn to the cover, but the story as well is very well told, very lovely. All right, last up. So my last podcast slash book suggestion is Welcome to Night Vale. This one has been around for a while. I think it's been out before I first started listening to podcasts, I'd just say like years and years ago. This one is really interesting because it takes the form of a radio show, and it happens in the town of Night Vale, and Night Vale is kind of like this weird, creepy town, and so each segment is about a strange or creepy or weird goings on in the town of Night Vale. And so you've kind of got that like comedy laced with a little bit of creep factor. There's definitely intrigue there, and if you guys are familiar with the podcast, you know that the format is also very entertaining. It's a very well produced podcast. Now, as far as the book suggestions, again, two suggestions for you guys. The first one is called Meddling Kids, and then the second one is called My Best Friend's Exorcism. Now, the reason that I chose both of these is because they both have that funny, campy horror to them, and so I think that just perfectly aligns with the whole concept behind the podcast. So Meddling Kids, if I just straight up, it's a Scooby-Doo rendition. If you guys are familiar with Scooby-Doo, you know they always say like, oh, I would have gotten away if it hadn't been for those meddling kids. So naturally, that's what this is about. You've got that same kind of archetype group of characters, including the dog, but this kind of takes Scooby-Doo to the whole new level. It's definitely not a book meant for kids, but it's just funny because it's meant for our age group Of course, our age group grew up on Scooby-Doo, but since we are older now, the story has also evolved with us, but definitely check that one out. And as far as My Best Friend's Exorcism, it is exactly what it sounds like. It is about a teenage girl whose best friend becomes possessed and she has to exorcise her to rid the demon of her body. So just like Meddling Kids, it's got that campy horror, sometimes funny moments to it, which I definitely can appreciate. I feel like horror books that have that campy wit to it are totally underrated, so definitely check this one out. And another reason why I love it, or rather it's an added bonus, is the cover of the book. So if you read it, let me know what you guys think about it. And in fact, since that brings us to the end, let me know what you think about any of these if you read them or if you have already read them. Same goes for the podcast. Like I said, I love podcasts, and now that I'm thinking about it, I probably should have put an addendum to my reading slump video that if you're in a reading slump, listen to podcasts, because that's exactly what I did last week. And lo and behold, I think I finally crawled out of my reading slump. But it's always fun to listen to podcasts, just because sometimes, like I said, I don't want to have to necessarily commit to a whole 9 to 14-hour book. I want something smaller. I want something episodic to where I get like a conclusion in a less amount of time. So yeah, I will stop rambling. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did, and if you want to see more content like this, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye!